We will get started. We are awaiting one more council member. Hopefully they will show up in time to allow us to take care of any action items that are on here. If not, we will just skip those. So I will call this meeting of the Public Works Infrastructure Committee together, our November 17th meeting. I am going to put approval of the minutes off for just a bit until we have a quorum. We have a couple of presentations today, so let's just go ahead and move into that. We'll start with an overview of the fleet replacement program, and I will turn it over to Hannah.
Okay, we'll get this up and going. Yes, that one. Thank you. Okay, so today we're going to do kind of a high-level overview of a couple of the options we've explored as a team with the fleet department, really putting a focus on our fleet replacement program and some of the options we can explore moving forward. So with the just kind of high level, we're going to go over a brief overview, a little bit of the history as to how we've handled things historically, a review of a Mercury report summary. So this is what was commissioned in 2015 by the city to help engage with a long-term strategic plan and give guidance based on industry best practices. We'll then review the pilot program that we have set up internally over the last 2 years, which is the Vehicle and Replacement Fund, or VERF, as you've seen it on the CIP and other documents. We'll also talk through some high-level options with enterprise or programs that are similar. So in kind of exploring all the different avenues, we've engaged with them to have some of the preliminary conversations to get a baseline of what that kind of program would encompass. And then just kind of a recap and get your guys' guidance on, what direction you feel we should continue to pursue. So overall, the city's fleet assets are a critical tool in many departments for successfully driving services to the community. These are often the least thought about for a lot of departments, but are often the most critical. Jackie will go over later some of the critical tools and equipment that she uses for street repair. And our fleet consists of everything from snow plows to sewer maintenance truck, road paving equipment, and then our police and fire emergency vehicles. In total, we have more than 1,000 vehicles and equipment that make up our fleet. So it's a wide range. Today, we're going to focus on the assets that are at 5,000 or more, so considered our capital assets. But as a division, we do support everything down to, weed eaters and trailers as well. So very wide range of scope. The challenges that the city's fleet is facing today is very similar to a number of the city assets. It's largely past its useful life. This is likely resulting of a higher operational cost, decreased reliability, and increased downtime of these assets. Our fleet department has increasingly become more of a repair shop than a preventative maintenance shop, as it was intended as a direct result of our aging fleet. So over the past year, to give you an idea, we've only spent about 27% of our work orders on preventative and the service that comes from these. So that's in stark comparison to an industry best practice of about 80 for municipal fleet division. So overview, the concerns that the city has on the aging fleet isn't limited to, just the maintenance and reliability. It's also related to other efficiencies such as fuel or employee safety. The fuel efficiencies over the last 20 years have increased tremendously. Based on the EPA's real-world miles per gallon report, the cars have seen an approximate 16% increase, and trucks 19%, which make up a large percentage of our fleet. Excluding our PD and fire vehicles, the city spends just over $500,000 annually on fuel. Including these different departments, we spend over $1 million. So it is a large percentage of expenditures that do come from fuel, and with an aging fleet, they're highly not efficient, I guess I should say. In addition to the efficiencies, it's also an employee safety concern. So out of the 229 medium and light duty fleet that we will talk about today, which is excluding the emergency response vehicles, 48% are 2012 or older, which predated the electronic stability control standardization across all of the vehicles. Another 87% are older than 2018, which is when backup cameras became more of a standard function to vehicles. So with this, it does, have a higher likelihood that some of our vehicles could have prevented accidents from occurring had they had these additional safety mechanisms in place. The new enhancements that have come out with safety aren't just limited to these true functionalities. There's others that we are exploring, especially with PD at this time, that are, the walk-up sensors to be able to detect cars that are, in your blind spot. Some of those different enhancements can improve the overall effectiveness of our fleet, as we'll have a reduced number of accidents as a direct correlation. So historically, the city has left the replacement cycle management up to the individual departments to act upon. Fleet has provided an annual report that recommends replacement of different assets based on age, mileage, and maintenance costs. But at the end of the day, it's the department's responsibility to secure funding and act upon these recommendations. This has resulted in approximately 47 new vehicles every year for an annual total of about $2.5 million spent on the replacement of these assets. And today we sit with an average fleet age of about 10.7 years. This decentralized approach was highly not recommended and identified as inconsistent with industry best practices when we conducted the 2015 Mercury report. So kind of in addition to some of our typical practices, we have had a couple departments that have tried lease programs, most notably fire and police. Fire has participated in lease-to-own kind of programs for their apparatuses, as they are incredibly expensive machinery. And police participated in a program for their patrol cars that lasted about 3 years. This resulted in a large number of the Ford Explorers infused into the fleet at about 30 per year during that time frame. It was pulled out of by a past police chief direction. And it really goes to illustrate that one of the risks of this decentralized approach is that, a change in departmental leadership can have long-term effects on the department and dramatically shift the way that we've started going down the path. So to kind of go over some of the high-level findings from the study to offer the baseline, when we engaged with Mercury in 2015, they were directed just to provide high-level guidance based on best practices and a base analysis of our fleet. At the time, our average age of our fleet was sitting at about 8.9 years. And keep in mind, please, that these are snapshots in time. Our fleet is changing very frequently. But currently, today, it sits at about 10.7. So over the last 5 years since we've done the study, we've actually gotten older, not younger, in terms of the age of our assets. To further illustrate some of the aging components of our fleet, in 2015 we had 173 of our vehicles, or about 22% of them being 15 years or older. This has increased to 26%, or 206 of our vehicles now sitting within that bucket. As you can see on the new one, it's kind of small in this graph. It's largely in the public works and utilities departments, and does include some of the heavier equipment that Jackie will talk about today and some of the challenges that we have discussed over this past year. So just kind of high note, overall the makeup of our fleet hasn't materially changed since 2015. We haven't had any dramatic shifts in terms of the makeup of different equipment, different departments. It's maintained relatively consistent. So with that, the assumptions made that the recommendations out of this study still hold true today, with an average fleet age of 4.8 years and a weighted replacement cycle of about 8.9. The recommendations that came out of the Mercury report were based on the economic theory of vehicle replacement. This targets to replace the vehicle at the point of minimum cost of ownership. To accomplish the study, Mercury divided our city fleet into 189 different replacement classifications. This was to help not only based on make and model, but also on intended use. So a good example of this is a generic SUV midsize would be recommended to replace at 120 months or 110,000 miles. While a SUV midsize for law enforcement, same vehicle but different use, is recommended to replace at 48 months or 85,000 miles. This is truly just based on the nature of the expected wear and tear on these vehicles from their intended purpose. So per the Mercury study, the actual age gap in the city's fleet is likely due to a lack of funding allocated to replace these assets consistently over time. This is likely resulting in the trade-off between a low capital cost and higher operating costs, which both incur in direct and indirect ways. The direct costs are inclusive of items we typically think about, such as higher maintenance, repairs, and fuel costs. And the indirect costs are inclusive of items such as downtime, reduced employee productivity as a result of, reduced vehicle safety, and typically a larger fleet than needed to allow for the backup, as a lot of the assets are anticipated to have larger downtimes. The recommendation out of the Mercury report was that the city establish a centralized fleet replacement program. The ideal way to approach this is a baseline program that would adjust funding year to year based on the specific needs of your fleet. You can see those in the chart are the blue bars. So there are wide ranges and swings from year to year in terms of the need based on our current composition of our fleet. So obviously not as practical for a municipality to be able to truly engage in a baseline replacement program model. The budgetary needs is not stable, so therefore would cause a lot of challenges in our ability to truly fund it appropriately. That is coupled with the fact that that first bar is showing the number of assets that would be required to be replaced year one. So a large influx would be needed up front in terms of a cash flow to get this program even started. And to make a more realistic approach, Mercury recommended a smooth funding program. This is the red bars. That would be calculated off of a long-term or 20-year plan is the model that they used. This would take the value of our fleet and divide it by the anticipated lifespan during that time or replacement cycle to come up with the average of $4.6 million per year to maintain an ideal life cycle. The 8.9 here is, or the 9.5 slightly different than the 8.9 earlier. And this is truly based on them looking at a 20-year window and making sure it was specific to our fleet and how we weighted out the lifespan of each and every class of vehicle that we had. To help fund this kind of program, Mercury gave us 4 different base options that are used today. We'll go over each one of these 4 and some of the high-level advantages and disadvantages to each of these. So the first is an outright purchase with ad hoc annual cash. This is the approach that we take today. It's widely used in the public sector, so generally accepted. It's very simple from a capital financing to administer, and there's no out-of-pocket interest. We typically pay for it as we accumulate it. The disadvantages is that, as we are seeing with our fleet, it almost always leads to suboptimal replacement decisions made from the conflict between the short-term budgetary needs and the long-term cost of ownership maximization. So it is one that, you know, again, it's where we're currently at today, and it is a method that we could move forward with, but would likely continue down the path of getting an older fleet versus a newer, as we've seen over the last 5 years. The next option is the debt financing, which is one that Jackie will go over as a recommendation for her large equipment and to meet some of the immediate needs. It does allow organizations to spread out the capital cost over the service lives, which help give it a flat and less year-to-year volatility. It also reduces the likelihood that we will divert the funds to other needs because we've already committed to it. The disadvantages, it does create a competition for use of limited borrowing capacity. which was one of the challenges we've talked about this last CIP cycle with prioritizing Jackie's equipment over some of the other items that are included in there, such as street construction or other higher profile needs. The third option is the reserve fund and chargeback system. This is the method that we are currently using for our pilot program. The advantage is that it helps incorporate a smooth and predictable funding, and it can slowly increase over time to support the gradual needs of inflation and other items. The reserve funds are typically less of a target for decision makers when they're looking at their budget versus an ad hoc cash-based. And it does encourage departments to regularly look at the makeup of their fleet as they are paying per vehicle into this fund. Some of the disadvantages is it does require a lot of administrative oversight to ensure that the fund balance does not get too large or diminishes. It also requires that you divert cash over other spending needs and can be a challenge when budgets get tight. We did experience some of that during our pilot program for the 2021 budget cycle, as departments were really hit hard and tasked with cutting costs. It's when you have other services that you typically provide to the community, sometimes your fleet management, while a critical tool, is not one that you prioritize over other needs based on the short-term demands. This also is a fairly expensive program to get jump-started. So based on the age of our fleet, to infuse this fund with enough cash to be able to meet our needs will require a substantial commitment by the city to help support that initiative. The CIP that we'll talk to later does have some cash out in future years to try to help encourage the conversation and move us in the right direction. And the final option that was explored were leasing programs. Advantages, minimal capital investment to get started. So a low buy-in option. Because it's a contractual obligation, you're less likely to divert funds during times of budgetary tightness. And it does keep the fleet on a very tight replacement cycle, so you're able to optimize and be agile as you move into the future. Some of the disadvantages is that there are additional costs incurred as part of the overhead. So we'll kind of explore a little bit of that, but they're not in it for the goodness of their hearts, they're in it to make a profit. So profit margins are calculated into your lease payments. The price to exit from a lease program is often very costly. You are either required to purchase the remaining value of the assets at the time of the end of the lease, or you can have the option to sell them and collect the difference, but then you're out the vehicles. It's also very challenging to try to meet the wide needs of our city fleet within a lease program that is all-encompassing. So likely we would have to engage in multiple lease agreements to be able to encompass our full needs. This is one of the areas where the team has engaged with Enterprise, and we'll talk about a little bit later to get a better understanding of what at least one version of this program could look like. So as I mentioned before, the city did start a pilot program in 2019 as the Vehicle and Replacement Fund. This was a direct response to this 2015 study and gave the departments a chance to really engage and set up the fund balance. The pilot program has been leveraged by 9 of the city's departments for 75 total assets. Over last year and this year, we're anticipated to replace 19 vehicles across 7 of the 9 departments, valued at about $1.2 million. This fund, based on the projections that we are currently seeing and the anticipated needs with a small 3% increase over time, is projected to have a healthy balance. This, however, has not been updated based on some of the 2021 funding, so we'll have to reevaluate. Programs such as this is critical to maintain a consistent influx of payments, as from year to year, different departments may experience a greater use of the funds than they've contributed, or vice versa, based on the overall needs of the fleet in total. So this is kind of the depiction that shows the contributions at a steady increase. So it's very predictable over time. And where you can see the balance and direct correlation with the expenses with the line in red. So there are years where the fund balance does build up so that the subsequent years can have large purchases associated with them. The cycles that were built into this initial plan were based on the individual departments that chose to participate and the assets that they put into the program, and were in conjunction with the recommendations provided in the report in terms of years, mileage, and costs associated with it.
Question quickly. So the fund started out with 700, 800,000.
It actually started out with 9. 300,000 was contributed by the fleet fund, based on the balance that we had put into the internal service fund, and then another 600 was infused by the general fund.
Okay.
So to align with the recommendations in this report, the team put in 2024 an infusion of cash in our CIP program to launch a citywide vehicle replacement fund. This is anticipated based on the recommendation at $4.5 million annually to continue over time to help this funds survive and also improve the health of our fleet. Right now, it is currently out of the cash bucket, so it would take an operational decision in terms of how are we going to support this $4.5 million, because currently today we only spend an average of $2.5 to $2.6 million annually on fleet replacement, which is varied by department and some even by potential funding sources. So with the enterprise lease option, this really focuses on the mid to light duty vehicles, and it does cover the acquisition, maintenance, and disposal of vehicles based on the recommended replacement cycles. They do provide a local dedicated support team to help the program and adjust the recommendations as needed. With this program, their replacement cycles are slightly varied from what we have talked about with the Mercury report. It's based on their own calculation. For the purpose of our engagement, we have chose to exclude the PD vehicles or emergency vehicles at this time to have a different conversation just to gain a baseline. And then to reiterate, it is only based on the mid to light duty. So the replacement cycles that Enterprise uses is truly built around when can you get the optimal resale to offset the initial costs, especially with our government purchasing options. We can typically get lower costs on new vehicles through leveraging state contracts and other means that are at our disposal. So based on the recommendation, they vary it by type. An example of this is they are recommending 12-month lease programs for trucks and non-emergency SUVs based on the low acquisition price that we have and today's current market for high resale in these type of vehicle classes. And then a standard 60-month lease term for sedans, vans, and hybrids. This can vary from year to year and is truly based on their projections. So there's no guarantee at the end of 12 months we would be positive as they have forecasted, but it is something they have leveraged in a lot of other municipalities and continuously focus on as it is the nature of their business. Part of the cost of ownership calculated into the enterprise maintenance agreement does count for a maintenance plan. This is exclusive of predictive repairs such as tires and brakes, but is inclusive of general preventative maintenance that would occur during the life of the vehicle. It is varied dependent upon the make, model, mileage, and lease terms. So it can range from a Chevy Malibu on a 60-month lease at $350 a year, up to a GMC Sierra 1500 truck, on the 12-month lease for $240. This is really based on the expectation that during the time of the lease, given the age of the vehicle, the manufacturer's warranty, that there will be little to no additional cost out of pocket with the exception of your preventive maintenance based on the to average 5,000 miles. The enterprise agreement can be concluded without having the maintenance agreement. So for example, the Malibu, the true lease cost is going to be $3,600 a year, and the GMC is $6,400 a year. This would be separate from the maintenance program itself. The maintenance program, or excuse me, the lease program with the enterprise does come at a management fee of 10% of your invoice cost, as well as interest charged against a 3-year treasury note with 350 basis points built in. So based on their estimates, and this is a screenshot directly from the information they have sent, so I apologize, some of the words are a little bit more confusing. But to start the program, it's relatively minimal year one expenses. Based on the initial selling of some of our older assets and purchasing the new, the net cash is estimated about $250 out of pocket. And this is based on the anticipated expense of $672,000 in lease payments against being able to sell the 111 vehicles that they are proposing for year one at a total of $423,000. Over the 5-year lease term for the 111 vehicles they're recommending, their projections would estimate a savings of about $570,000. The risk is the only way the city is going to realize it is either to continue the lease program and reinfuse the $570,000 into new lease payments or additional vehicles being added on, or to sell the vehicles at that point and realize the $570,000. If we chose to exit at the end of the 5-year term, the cost to exit would be $2.3 million. So that is the risk with any lease program, is if you choose to exit it, you either sell your assets or you have a large cash need at that time. The enterprise lease option that we talked to them about wasn't just 5 years, and it wasn't just the 111 vehicles that would hit year one. They looked at it over the next 10-year period to project out what they would anticipate the city saving by switching from our older fleet to a newer fleet, which would have some inherent maintenance and fuel economies built into the model. Over the course of the next 5 years, they've projected that out of our 229 medium and light duty non-PD vehicles, we would have 100% of those migrated to a lease program to be able to realize almost $3 million in anticipated 10-year savings. This is a current model that Shawnee County is actually engaged in. They have been using it for Parks and Rec for the last couple years for their trucks. It is one that has been started to roll out to other departments a little bit more widely over this last year, but is a little bit more of a decentralized approach in terms of their departments manage it independently. They have seen and realized some of the value that Enterprise has spoke to us about regarding the trucks and the 12-month lease programs in terms of being cash positive given the current market. That, of course, is based on the current market and could drop off at any point, so it's not a guarantee. So kind of high-level summary, just to kind of touch back on, to continue to support the teams in successfully delivering services to the community, the city really needs to deploy a strong fleet management program that spans all vehicles and equipment. The continued choice between short-term budgetary savings versus purchasing vehicles on the total cost of ownership models has resulted in an old, unreliable, and unsustainable fleet model. The Fleet Replacement Sinking Fund is the most desirable form and comprehensive and consistent approach. It is also the low-cost option, as there'd be no profit margin built into the pricing, as there is with lease options. With this approach, there would be a need for a large amount of cash to infuse the fund to jumpstart it, and would require a large commitment from the city to support this fund long-term. If it doesn't have the support of the leadership and the governing body moving forward, it becomes a target in terms of meeting budgetary shortfalls, which can continue to perpetuate or have unintended consequences longer term. The lease program is an appealing option as it would quickly improve the health of our overall fleet for our mid to light duty vehicles. It would allow us to take a more agile approach to changing needs and will require little upfront cash. The two major risks in a lease agreement is the cash at time of exit, as well as the overhead rate increasing, impacting our long-term obligations. So with that, kind of open it up to the governing body to help provide guidance on what you would see as a desired path forward. What you would anticipate the scope of a fleet replacement fund being, ideally, and discussing the options between lease versus a self-funding sinking program.
All right, thank you. Questions, Councilman Padilla?
Not right now, thank you, Neil. Appreciate it.
Okay, Councilman Emerson?
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, sure can.
Okay, so first of all, sorry I'm late. I got hung up on a job and then, anyway, and I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing, is it Ulrich, your last name?
Yeah, Ulrich.
Ulrich, okay. Ms. Ulrich, first of all, thank you for the information. I did read through all that. Of course, we spoke a little bit this morning. I did have some question on the enterprise lease program. Are you recommending that, or is that simply information right now?
At this point, it's information. I think it is a very solid option if we were to consider it as a hybrid model. It doesn't have the applicable nature for the large equipment or heavy duty items, but it could be a good way to help infuse a new fleet and help reduce our operational costs immediately. If that's the direction that the body would like to go in terms of how we want to commit our cash. Is it more on an operational ongoing basis or in a self-funded fleet program that we manage internally?
Other questions, Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that answer. Is that something you're recommending starting like, I know you said right now you have a pilot program, I know with fleet. Is that enterprise, is that something you'd want to start immediately or next year? Or I saw on one of your slides that said it's talking about 2024. Can you, I guess, elaborate on your timing a little bit?
Absolutely. If we were to go with an enterprise agreement, I would like to start it in 2021. There would be some challenges in terms of some funding sources that we'd have to work through with the different departments. But I feel that continuing to wait to engage in a lease-based program would be not a wise choice in terms of what we're experiencing now with higher operational costs. If we were to decide that a lease program wasn't the direction as a city we wanted to go, then I would recommend we kind of try to infuse more departments over the next few years until we get to the large cash influx built into the CIB in 2024.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, if I could ask one more follow-up, please.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Thank you. And I guess maybe I shouldn't have said this was a follow-up, and I apologize, you might have, when I was trying to get in, you might have already answered this or brought this up. But I know that we have, I think it was kind of optional for departments to use centralized fleet management or not. First of all, is that still the case?
Yes, we have the individual departments retain the authority and the ultimate decision-making in terms of the replacement needs of their fleet.
Okay, and is that, I guess, can you kind of discuss the advantages or the disadvantages of that? I mean, is that best practice?
It is not best practice. Best practice is typically a centralized fleet program, as you are putting the both the accountability as well as the ownership on a fleet division that is typically the subject matter experts. It allows one division to centralize it and make decisions that are based upon the value between infusing a new item into the fleet versus the immediate cost that a fleet department receives with operational repairs that hit their budget. As we have it today, we have departments that do pay for the repairs in terms of the immediate cost with the cost of the actual items. So if we bill out a filter, we bill it out each month and they pay for that at the time. Otherwise, they receive a consistent flat bill at the end of the year for the next year that is based upon their percentage of utilization. So it doesn't incentivize the departments directly to prioritize capital dollars to get a new fleet, because in their mind it's relatively small for most departments, the cost of maintaining an older vehicle. Best practices is typically to centralize that approach so that you can leverage a citywide fleet. So one department may get a new vehicle one year and the next department another, but they're both paying in, and as a city or as an organization, you're able to balance the needs of the divisions more equitably versus leaving it up to the individual departments to manage on an operational basis.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all the questions I have at this time.
Great. And we have another councilwoman joining us. Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala, do you have any questions at this point?
No, Chair, just listening in for the most part. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I do have a couple. Maybe this one, I'll ask you, it may be for the city manager. Is there any issues with cash basis law when you do a long-term lease like that? I mean, we're committing a future governing body to potentially a pretty good size payout, right?
We are, and in terms of law, Brent could speak to it more, but we do build in the lack of appropriation into all of our contracts, which is how a lot of our contracts do span longer periods of time without guaranteed secure funding. Okay. So that would be an element that would be built in into this agreement, and I'm sure would have an additional clause from Enterprise as they've done this for other municipalities, both locally and also nationwide.
Okay.
Yeah, we would definitely have to build in a clause to get out of
Mr.
this,
Chair?
if there was.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
It's Mary Feeney. On that cash basis question, if we do a lease purchase agreement, it would have to be approved by the governing body, and it would have to comply with certain provisions of the cash basis law.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, with her comments, you know, it's one of those things that we would need to look at each year, each governing body, and there may be a change of heart. I mean, this is an experimentation, and from that sense, if we find that it's working right, hopefully we'll be able to show, and the governing body will see the light that this is something that we want to pursue each year. But things can change, and the conditions that exist right now that show this is favorable might change in 2 to 3 years, and therefore we would want to change our approach. And so I think that for us, we always put a flexibility of some sort in our agreements on something like this to get out.
Do you have any idea how much it cost? What's the comparison between leasing and we have the money to buy the vehicles,
Right.
And maintain them over the same period of time? What's the difference?
Based on the Enterprises agreement, we're looking at a minimum of a 10% difference as they charge a 10% upfront fee based on the invoicing price. The more of a bonding percentage in terms of their loan rates, with the 350 basis points, you're looking at a minimum of obviously 3.5, but closer to probably 3 3/4 or 4%, as we know that a lot of the rates right now are particularly low. So it is most likely a more cost prohibitive in terms of the fees. However, there is an advantage to having another independent organization manage it for us, so we don't have to spend internal resources to balance the account. The future forecasting methods that are going to be needed to do a citywide program, if we self-funded it, would be very complex and would definitely take some staff time to dedicate to make sure that we're not moving the fund too dramatically in one direction. So there would be a trade-off from some of the time in-house to truly manage it, but at a minimum 10%.
Plus the financing.
plus the financing fees.
Okay. All right. I know you mentioned that the Mercury study had 189 different categories, which seems like it's probably about 180 more than you need, but so we've talked about light and medium duty vehicles, trucks, SUVs, cars, I assume.
Yep.
220 plus in that category eventually.
Yeah, and the 220 would just be in non-emergency.
Right.
So we have another 200 of them within our fleet that are dedicated to PD. And so in total, we'd probably look around 380 to 400 to move to a program such as this.
So you'd be looking at emergency vehicles going into the lease program at some
Potentially.
point. Okay.
I had talked to Chief Cochran about his experience. He was not chief at the time that the PD had the lease program to receive the new Explorers. He was open to exploring the idea. There's not as much of a cash upside from Enterprise's program solution, which typically focuses on optimizing resale value just based on the nature of the vehicles. So we'd want to make sure that we could dive a little bit more deeply into how many of the vehicles are truly used for that purpose versus how many are admin, but may still follow the SUV just because he's handed them down over the years. So there'd be more exploration. I don't think I would recommend that we put patrol vehicles on lease. I feel that's very risky. There's a lot of additional upping the equipment essentially that we have to do, and with the liability that comes with wrecking a vehicle and then being liable for a lease program as an immediate payout would be something I don't think we'd want to take on. But outside of probably anywhere between 40 and 80 vehicles falling in that classification, it could easily infuse a larger number into the 229.
So you could be upwards of 300 without getting into the
Probably, yes.
vehicles. Let me, just a thought I had. So you've got the light and medium duty, and then what are the other major categories? Obviously heavy equipment. I assume fire trucks fall in there someplace. What else are? Yeah,
the fire trucks fall in. A lot of the stuff is, the dump trucks, snowplow equipment that kind of gets mounted on a lot of Jackie's equipment, the different road pavement equipment that Jackie uses in hers, the different specialized equipment that is out at water pollution and the water treatment plants. So your big trucks that go out and clean the sewer lines.
Yeah.
All of those are included, which is why that did span. I too would probably agree it's a little excessive at 189 categories, but they were really trying to make sure that they were tailoring the approach to our fleet. But it's a very wide range.
So I assume at some point we're going to discuss at what point does it not make sense to lease, right? I mean,
Yes.
trucks or SUVs
Right.
and cars and light trucks maybe make more sense than some of the other things. Okay.
And some of that we're going to talk through today. Jackie has a proposal to use debt financing as a way to help improve the health of the large equipment and heavy duty machinery as it meets the threshold of our capital bonding policies. So that is a way that we can leverage it without hitting directly into operational funds that have been very tight. I don't know, based on the market that exists, we would need to do more exploring if we wanted to do a heavy-duty lease program. It would not be through Enterprise, so it would require a separate lease engagement. But it is something that if that's the direction the governing body wants to proceed, we can continue to explore. We would then just start to run into the challenge of managing multiple different programs and the complexities that would add to our general planning cycles.
If we didn't lease and we tried to self-fund this at a level that makes sense, which we're obviously not doing now, right?
Right.
And we talked about bonding these vehicles aren't eligible for PO bonding, are they?
Most of them are not. If you look at the basic vehicles, and typically what I've seen is you don't want to do that. Even our police cars, especially our police cars, with only keep the frontline cars, get about 2 good years out of them, and they're having to rotate them out. So bonding for them is not a good idea. And I see Steve, Wade, and Jessica are both on here, and I would imagine they'll support me on that, would think that they would agree with me based on conversations I've had. We want to avoid that with the smaller vehicles if at all possible. But when you look at how long we keep some of our heavy equipment that you're referring to that Jackie uses,
I'll be going on.
yeah, we keep that equipment a long time. We put a limited number of miles on them, and because of the type of construction those kind of equipment is, it can last that period of time. And so it does make sense related to fitting into selling GO bonds in order to be able to support it and not affect what we need to have for operations. And actually, in the long run, by replacing some of that with bonded purchase vehicles, we can reduce our operating costs out of our fund by not having to make replacements on some of these vehicles as they get 20 years old, fixing them the way we have to. The one quick comment I wanted to make, and I don't like the idea right now of going into enterprise with related to the police vehicles. I talked to Chief, and sometimes we're putting up to 50,000 miles a year on those vehicles. So the resale value of those vehicles is so bad with us owning them is much better. And we typically lose anywhere from 4 to 6 of those vehicles in a given year to accidents. Some our fault, some their fault, someone else's fault. It's just because of the miles, the exposure we get. So that they're not a good candidate, in my opinion, for a lease program.
Okay. So self-funding is going to be cash, basically,
Right.
every year.
Yeah.
Okay. And to the tune of 4.6 million or whatever.
For a citywide, and a lot of Jackie's equipment and the heavy duty ones, as Brent said, does have a longer age. And that was reflective in the Mercury report, which helps drive up, surprisingly, some of the age recommendations. So, for example, for a Class 8 dump truck, that has a recommended life of about 12 years or 125,000 miles. We don't anticipate, we put many miles on a lot of our dump trucks or heavy duty just by the nature of, water pollution or some of the plants. Some of Jackie's get a little bit more, but most of it's idle time while it's out on the job site. So those pieces of equipment we do anticipate to hold on for longer periods, but it's very specific to that individual item. And so it does make it a good candidate for bonding to help balance out some of that 4.6 need every year to make sure it's not all cash operational based, given our limited funds.
So the 4.6 includes everything.
It includes everything. So part of that, some of the funding that Jackie's going to talk about today could help reduce some of those obligations. There are other items that would be eligible to be included. Jackie's operating within the constraints of the approved CIP amount because it does become that point of then competing for other capital funds as we have that cap that we stick very heavily to.
Right. Good. Thank you. One more call for questions, I guess. Councilman Padilla, Deputy Mayor Emerson.
Nothing right now, thank you.
All right, very good. I think if we could, probably makes sense to move into the next presentation and then maybe talk about both of these together. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is the first year of approved CIPGO bond program, which is a dedicated funding for fleet replacement for our Transportation Operations Division, and it's equipment for the bonding requirements of equipment that has a replacement cost of greater than $125,000. And as you know, transportation operations includes street as well as traffic operations and forestry department. Okay. And so based on those, or as Hannah was saying, that the recognition of a dedicated funding came about from years of non-reliable equipment, non-operable equipment for the departments to do our services that were required. Using that Mercury report from 2015, we identified that we have a backlog between 2015 through 2020 that were eligible candidates or pieces of equipment eligible for replacement, 16 units. And then we identify in 21 through 25, we have another 17 units that are eligible for replacement. So I've requested that looking forward from 21 to 25, we're looking at a total of 33 units that need to be replaced because there's this backlog that we've never had our dedicated funding to replace equipment timely. We also are taking into account the annual report we received from the fleet department they provide a list of candidates that are eligible for equipment replacement. This includes the criteria of the age, meter, the hours or miles, and then of course the dollars that are spent in maintaining and repairing that piece of equipment. It's a rating system from 1 to 15, and the higher the number, it's a better candidate for replacement. So as managers, we came together, took the Mercury report recommendations for replacement along with the annual report we received from Fleet and determined what our candidates would be for proposing for 2021. And that's identified right there. It's 7 units to be replaced with 6. And then we'll go through each of these individually with more detail. But you'll see that there's 2 bucket trucks for the Forestry Department, 3 single axle dump trucks equipped with plow and spreaders, and 2 motor graders. All these units were identified in the Mercury report as candidates, as well as all of them had rankings of 15 out of the Fleet Department's annual report as candidates. I do want to mention that all of these units for forestry and street, the bucket trucks, dump trucks, and motor graders, these are used daily and weekly, every week, year-round. So they're very essential all year round to performing the services we provide. So the first truck we're looking at is a medium-duty bucket truck for the Forestry Department. It has an arm of 60 feet, and so it can reach those tall trees and do their work. Its current age is 22 years, and the recommended replacement cycle from Mercury was a 12-year replacement. The arm on that bucket truck, it gets certified annually by an outside firm. This year, they certified that the arm could be certified, but they said there's no guarantee that future certification could be in jeopardy based on its age and condition, so that it may not have much of a future. The second bucket truck for forestry is a smaller bucket truck with an arm of 45 to 50 feet long. This is a smaller unit, and it's used for those tighter spaces, such as down the alleys to do trimming. They use it often at the zoo. Unfortunately, this year, it's a 19-year-old vehicle, and it's recommended to be on a 12-year replacement cycle. This year, it hasn't been available for use since May for different reasons. They had to replace the engine, and then they replaced that. Then the hydraulics have gone out on it, and then once they've gotten that resolved, there's another issue. So they've been out of their bucket trucks to perform work for an extended period of time this year. The next item is single axle dump trucks for the street department. I'm requesting for replacement of the 3 oldest, which are 13 to 15 years old. They're a recommended life cycle of 12 years. These are like the nuts and bolts of the street department. They're used every day, whether we're doing street repairs, whether we're repairing alleys. It supports street sweeping, and during snow and ice events with the plow and spreaders, they're running 24 hours a day, 2 12-hour shifts.
Question.
Yes.
Was the wrecker there, or did you pay them to come in for the picture?
It really was there,
Okay.
Yes. And then the last item are some motor graders. I'm requesting that we replace 2 of these and replace it with 1 newer one. These are used to regrade unpaved alleys and those few streets unpaved that we have. And so that has a 12-year recommended life cycle. They are 23 and 24 years old.
Is it 12 or 20 replacement cycle? Over here it says, on your grid, it says 20.
Good question. Brian Bigumwalt, can you confirm?
I'm pretty certain that it's supposed to be 20 years.
Okay, thank you.
20.
I apologize for
That's
that
all right.
error. They're still older
In
than the
excess,
cycle.
yeah, 24 and 23. Yeah.
And then we do use, yeah, I said this, we use these to regrade our unpaved alleys and streets. And so that's my recommendation of what pieces of equipment I would like to replace in 2021 with the GO bonds that
All right. Questions? Councilman Padilla?
I do have one. I'm just wondering, with regards to the forestry department, do we have other companies pick up the slack, as it were, for work in the city that we're unable to perform because of a lack of a larger crew or more vehicles? I'm just wondering how often we use those buckets, or if it's a good idea for us to keep those on hand, or to use other resources, outsource it.
we do have some money dedicated in forestry's budget for contract services, but when those high wind storms and tornadoes come through, it takes all of us together, private sector and the public. But I do have our forester, Travis Tenbrink, available. If Travis, you want to add anything further?
Yeah, hello, this is Travis. We do have a small amount of money in our operational budget for contract work, but it does not get us very far. I use that for backlog work that we have, but unfortunately that keeps getting whittled away, so it's not a strong source. And so it's pretty much just falls on us as a department.
Deputy Mayor Emerson, any questions?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Vogel, first of all, thank you for your presentation. I did wonder, I think Ms. Goodrick earlier talked about, they have some of the departments they might buy dump trucks, some of the other departments she's working with. Are the trucks you buy, does her department somehow get involved with those? And I guess coming from here is, if you want to buy 3 trucks, but another department needs 2 trucks, so we go in and get 5 so we get a better price.
I didn't catch all of that.
I'm hearing kind of an echo. Anybody else?
I couldn't really, sorry.
I'm sorry, is that any better at all? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Vogel, I guess I had a question. Earlier, Ms. Ulrich was talking about dump trucks as one of the items that might be under fleet. Do we do any sort of, bunching of purchases? You had 3 dump trucks, single axle dump trucks here you're talking about replacing. Maybe some other department has 2 others. Do we do anything where we might get a price on 5 at a time rather than just 3?
I'm not sure I heard that.
She's asking about combining purchases, so I'm assuming the other dump trucks are used in utilities, for instance, but those fall under fleet as well, right?
Well, fleet helps in the speccing and acquisition, but they are truly in the independent departments.
It's a different revenue
They have a different
source.
revenue source.
They have a different revenue source, and they still manage it independently. They do work with, and Brian can probably speak to a little bit more in terms of how he helps prioritize or if he's able to group together some of the purchases. But with it being an ad hoc basis, oftentimes we don't know what vehicles we're going to go out and acquire that year until budgets have a chance to start to realize, with the exception of a few up front. So with it being kind of a fallback fund, and he can correct me if I'm misspeaking, it's one that is inconsistent in terms of consistent planning across all departments.
And Braxton's on too.
Yeah.
That is correct, but I think Councilman Emerson's question was, do we combine the buying power to buy a cheaper truck if we're buying more? Yes, we do. We buy those off the state of Kansas contract where we can. So that does help us. However, it doesn't matter if it's 1 or 10 because we're buying it off the state of Kansas contract.
Okay, thank you. That was my question. Thank you very much for answering that.
So dump trucks fall under the state of Kansas contract?
You can piggyback off the state of
Okay.
Kansas
Is that
contract.
generally the best price, or?
The last dump trucks we purchased, we did piggyback off the state of Kansas contract, but those were tandems, and I'm requesting single axle. I am going to pursue, once these are approved, to see if there's other municipality contracts that are going out for a single axle that we could piggyback in bulk purchase.
Okay.
If their specking or their needs are similar enough to ours, which I suspect they are.
So I guess Deputy Mayor Emerson's question was, are there other departments? I think the answer was, we don't know. As far as utilities, I assume somebody's going to ask that question before these purchases are made, so.
My understanding is, Braxton, my understanding is all of their trucks are tandems.
Okay.
Correct.
Well, that was the shortest answer today. Correct. All right, that makes sense. So we need approval. This, just to recap, this is in the CIP that was approved, but needs approval to go back to the council because it falls in that category. I guess if there's no other questions, we need a motion to approve the purchase of 6 vehicles, 7?
6.
6 vehicles. Trading in 7 in 2021.
So moved, Mr. Chairman. Not sure if you heard me, but I move approval.
Yes, we've got that. Do I have a second? Have a second. Second from Councilman Padilla. All those in favor say aye or wave your hand.
Aye.
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 All right.
Aye.
Motion passes. So that's a recommendation to the full council for the purchase of those vehicles. What kind of action are you looking at going forward? I mean, we're down to, do we cash fund at I'm assuming the $1 million+ a year for heavy equipment's in the CIP already, programmed in, assuming we do that. So we're really focused on medium, lightweight vehicles,
Right.
whether we lease or cash fund.
Yes, what I'm looking for is the kind of general direction on how you would like us to proceed. So there's still a lot of conversations if we go lease-based with legal and finance to work out what that means, make sure we're in compliance, and identify the ideal target fleet makeup of that. If it's cash-based, then we still need to work, especially with finance, to look as we build out this next budget period, what that looks like from an operational standpoint, and how we could identify sources of funding or have additional conversations with the various departments that it would impact.
So 2021, what's in the budget right now for this category of vehicles?
I couldn't tell you exactly. It's decentralized. So each department has budgeted. We'd have to go pull the individual budget line items and confirm what is truly allocated in those lines. We do have support for 8 out of the 9 departments that are still participating in the pilot program. That's still continuing into the 2021 budget period. So that would encompass I believe it's just over 70 vehicles would still be already included in there. So we would have to go and do further exploration to get that number.
I would suspect that everyone's approved 2021 budget has a line item of capital outlay, and that's where you would normally purchase those vehicles if and when that was the priority.
Right.
And so it's not necessarily going to be identified as pickups or roller or any specific item, I don't believe.
But if we move ahead with the enterprise program, you would be purchasing, in essence, 120 vehicles in 2021, right?
That was the recommendation. So the cash to fund the initial 111 vehicles would net about 250 that we'd have to identify a source. If we were to pull out of some of the lighter duty vehicles that are currently sitting in the replacement fund pilot program, we could explore leveraging some of that cash as that influx to offset year one. We would need to meet with the departments that are impacted and discuss what the financing obligations would be, since we don't, as a fleet division, we don't have operational authority or budget authority over those dollars.
So really the question is, do we invest staff time in pursuing the leasing program at this point in time? Do we put it off a year? Do we put it off indefinitely? I guess I'd look for some input from the council members on the call. Councilman Padilla, you look like you want to provide some input. You're on mute. There you go.
I could barely hear on that last exchange. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, I think the direction that Fleet is looking for is whether to invest staff time in pursuit of an enterprise leasing program. Right now, it looks like you'd be looking at 111 vehicles in 2021, new, medium, and light vehicles, non-emergency, as opposed to individual departments purchasing their own vehicles. I do think that's one piece of information that would be helpful. It doesn't have to be exact, but are we looking at
That's what I was
50
saying.
new vehicles cash purchase versus 111 leased? So really the question is, does staff invest their time in this? You've got to think this is a pretty good idea, right?
I think there's a place for a hybrid model. Given our current climate and the financial obligations that we have, I struggle to envision 2024 coming around and the city being able to have the influx in cash to support a citywide program rollout.
Right.
We are seeing continuous increase in our operational costs associated with our aging fleet, and we've only gotten worse over the last 5 years. There's been huge changes. I think that we'd be able to receive a lot of benefit if we went with this direction, but we have to be very cognitive of the risk and the obligation that's putting the city under. I think our large equipment and heavy duty items doesn't make sense to explore a lease based on the nature of their use and the other funding mechanisms that are available.
Right.
But in terms of our light duty and medium duty kind of trucks and those sort of items that we use for inspectors or city manager's car or other vehicles.
He doesn't need one. Get him a bicycle.
He is driving a
There you
Pyrus
go.
now. He does like his hybrid version. But as we continue to explore, I think it is a very viable option. The county has seen good preliminary results. It's a much smaller scale than what we would want to do based on the scope of our fleet and the size that we have. If we were going to make a material difference and truly cut our costs to where we could help start to decrease and move that trend in the right direction, we would have to take a fairly sizable leap forward, in my opinion.
Okay. Very good. City manager, if I might, I'd appreciate a little bit of input from the finance
I can wait.
department. either Jessica or Stephen.
Hi, I haven't looked at the presentation beforehand. I didn't have it, so I don't have some of the numbers that Hannah's presented, but it's definitely something that we can look into. In terms of rolling it out like at the very beginning of 21, I do think that would be difficult given the time between now and the end of the year. My concern, and one that I would want to look further into in terms of the enterprise model, would be to understand how other municipalities prepare for the event that you had to unwind it. I mean, the unwinding cost is the biggest downside risk, I think. And in terms of, is that your question in terms of feedback, is the enterprise model?
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think to go with what Jessica's saying, I think, looking at, I'd want to get the exact number related to how many vehicles was each department planning to do. And the second part is them understanding and working with finance to know the exact payment cash-wise that they're going to need to put in their budget to pay for the lease of that vehicle that's going to be replaced. And so that we make sure that we're not setting up the annual cost that we can't afford. And it's there. I think the model looks right, but I think it would be good to make sure that we're not setting up a department that's got a lot of vehicles that uses one vehicle per person, such as our code enforcement guys. There's one person per truck that's going out there. And so then that creates an expense for that department, and making sure that individually we look at each department and how it would be impacted, and what they already were planning to do, some that are involved in the program. I really think the ones that potentially could actually be affected the worst are those that, for example, this year did not make a plan to purchase a vehicle. They have nothing setting there to now all of a sudden having a vehicle into the lease program. They don't have any money in their budget this year to pay for that. And granted, it's only $250,000, and that's probably where we would have to go. We'd have to go to raid a little bit out of that equipment replacement fund in order to start it. But I think that'd be finalizing the model that she's developed, would be pulling it down to the department level, and then them understanding how it affects each department.
So what's the timeline for this? I mean, if you go ahead and start exploring this option, when does it come to council? Roughly, I mean,
probably not until late spring would be my guess in 21, to make sure we have ample time to have all departments review. We've had some engagement from contracts, procurement, and finance, just in initial conversations, but we haven't dived a lot into the specific numbers in terms of how it would impact each individual department or line item. So we would want to take the time and make sure that we do our due diligence and set up the agreement that complies with us from a legal standpoint as well. Given that Shawnee County has done it, I'm confident that if we wanted to go this direction, we could figure out a way to work through some of those challenges. But it would likely not be until late spring to kind of bring the idea. But before putting in that effort and the staff time that's already quite limited these days, wanted to make sure the direction was something that this group felt was important, or if the direction would be better spent to look at the 2022 budget period for starting to infuse more cash-based funding versus a lease obligation.
I personally like the idea of exploring the lease option. I know in the private sector it's used pretty extensively and successfully. It's different, but it is successful. Councilman Padilla, your thoughts about moving forward with exploring the lease option?
I'd like to go ahead and move forward with that. I don't know that I have seen a lot in the presentation on how that also affects our maintenance costs. I mean, with the lease, will a lot of that maintenance be taken care of by the providers, the vendors, I guess, or what comparison do we have in reduction or increase in maintenance costs? But I like the idea generally.
Yeah, I think the idea is we still pay the maintenance cost on it, right, the city, but
Yep.
but you're getting rid of the vehicle before the cost.
Our recommendation would
prohibitive.
not to participate in Enterprise's maintenance program, as it's far cheaper for us to perform those preventive maintenance in-house, which is part of that, I think, trial by fire, quite honestly, in terms of understanding the impacts that would have to our fleet division.
Right.
So as we've talked about, the impacts of the other departmental budgets, it would have a direct correlation on the fleet budget, as it's predominantly become a repair shop, and we've had the man support, the equipment, all the items that go with that to support our current fleet. We would want to understand what the long-term impacts are and how that financially would start to trickle down. The challenge would be, quite honestly, is it's probably not going to be a one-for-one in terms of departmental savings. It would have to be a balancing act between how we have it currently set up from a funding standpoint, with individual departments paying for the lease fees, as well as a separate line item for their fleet fees, and how those two would complement each other.
Okay, very good. Deputy Mayor Emerson, any thoughts on moving forward with the leasing option?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I am in total agreement with you and Councilman Padilla that we should move forward in exploring that. And I know for myself, what I would love to see is maybe a comparison between the life cycle costs of buying, owning, maintaining a vehicle versus the lease. And I saw some of that I saw some things in your presentation about that in the enterprise lease thing, but I'd love to see an example, some real world examples of a few different types. That would kind of give me comfort.
Thank you. Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala, any thoughts moving forward?
Chair, I like the idea of what Tony is saying is cost comparison. I also think looking in more deeply into the leasing sounds beneficial with the smaller and mid-use vehicles. So I'm in agreement with what y'all are saying.
Very good, thank you. I assume that you had a graph in there that showed capital cost and maintenance cost. I assume you could produce something similar, that the lease costs are going to be lower than the capital cost, but the rides is going to be at the end where you have to pay it out, right? So somewhere in there is the sweet spot.
Right, and between the two, it's just that risk of the cost of exit. So
Right.
understanding what we're taking on as a city and how we're committing ourselves, because the model will most likely show as savings based on the current age of our fleet and the current efficiencies with
Right.
fuel and some of those items. But it's understanding, the long-term reinvestment plan. So for example, Shawnee County for the Parks and Rec Department is primarily trucks. They've leased almost 30 of them at this point. And over the last 3 years, they've actually seen a decrease in their lease payments because they have kept to essentially the same number of vehicles. And they've reinvested the cash, the equity that they made upon selling it after 1 year term, back into it. So they've been able to expand out a little bit and maintain flat because the individuals have gone down. So they are realizing it within their model, leveraging enterprise. So it would be a balance of assumptions. We haven't currently gone through some of the financial analysis in terms of in-depth. It's been more what's been presented to us from Enterprise's salesmen, as well as some of the outputs of the Mercury report to help understand. So that would be where the level of effort from our internal staff would start to pick up, but it didn't want to prematurely invest the time if that wasn't the direction the governing body was wanting to proceed.
Right. I think the directions to move forward, it makes a lot of sense.
And the other important thing with knowing that is we want to make sure that if we're looking at this, we're not making any purchases of vehicles in the first quarter. And so that's good for us to know as well, because there may have been intentions that first quarter purchases would occur. We can hold off on those and look at second quarter because a decision would be made hopefully in the first quarter as to whether to proceed. So that helps us as well.
And I would assume maybe at the December meeting, we could get an update on what you have learned at that time. Ultimately would love to hear from the finance department and the legal department on any concerns. So.
Yep, we'll marry those together.
Very good. Thanks for both presentations. Good background. I continue to learn a lot, so appreciate that. Item 5 is update of the 50/50 sidewalk repair program, which is going to be a short presentation, I understand.
Yes, we're still working on the policy change or update. Councilmember Emerson did provide us with a copy of the city's utility indefinite quantity contracts for us to review to see if that might work for sidewalks. And we plan to bring an update back in December.
Great. Thank you very much. Do we have...
Chair?
Yes.
I didn't know if this was the opportune moment or not, but I've been getting caught up on all of y'all's meetings and noticed that there was quite a bit of information that was provided for the 50/50 sidewalk program and the changes that we're talking about being implemented. And I did have some questions. So is this the time I could ask questions?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Councilwoman.
Okay. I guess if the application process, I don't know if that's what you guys are looking at in front of you, but I don't have a copy of the application. So I guess this would be basically, is the contract a pretty lengthy process for citizens to fill out, or is it a pretty short form? That would be my first question.
Actually, it's fairly straightforward for the resident. These are only deal with residential properties. The process right now involves the city actually bidding the work at the beginning of the year. Then when sidewalk issues are identified, we notify the property owner that they need to fix their sidewalk. We also let them know about the 50/50 program. And if they are interested, we let them know what their cost would be. And if they send us a check for that amount, then we put them on the list to be replaced.
And that's the new process that you're talking about implementing
That's actually
versus...
the current process right now. That's the current process right now.
That's the current process right now.
There are a lot of issues with that we're finding from a staff level and from a resident's perspective, excuse me. It takes a lot of time to get that done. We don't have contractors right now that will go out and just do one section of sidewalk. And so we bundle a bunch of different sidewalks together before we release the contractor. And so a resident could send their money in May, but we may not do the work until August or September.
Yeah, and I know that from the last meeting, you're saying you bundle it and then they go around in their area so it doesn't all get done right away. So that was one of the issues versus having them be more standalone residents doing it themselves. But before we get into what the new process is, then can you just tell me on average how much a citizen has to pay in the 50/50 project? What is the range of cost?
Quite honestly, it can vary. It could be one section of sidewalk that's bad. And the cost that we're getting is about $8 a square foot. So if it's a 4-foot piece of sidewalk, 4 foot wide by 8 foot long, it's 32 square feet at $8 a square foot. It gives you a feel for they pay half of that.
Okay, I don't have my calculator here, so
The chair's doing the number real quick, but that's probably $240 to $300 for one section of sidewalk. But there are sections of sidewalk that could be almost the full length of a property. And so a property frontage may be 70 feet to 100 feet. And so those prices go up significantly.
Okay, and then let's just say it's anywhere from the $240 to $300 range. Is that what you're saying is then would be divided up between the old way between the city and the resident?
Correct. What we look at is we look at the total price, and so if we say $300, we'd send them an invoice for $150, And once we receive that payment, then they would go on that waiting list to get their sidewalk replaced.
Okay, and can you tell me, do you record how many of these sidewalks the city does a year? I know you said, or it was stated, am I talking to Brian? I can't see who that is.
Yes, it's Brian.
Oh, hey, Brian. Okay, so is that 500,000 is how much you're giving to the program? Is it 100,000 in 2021?
It's actually 100,000 each year.
100,000 each year, and about how many sidewalks are done, or how many individual residents participate in that per year?
I'd have to get back with you. I don't know off the top of my head. I'll get back with you on that.
I would like to know that for the past 5 years.
Sure.
Do you find that you have money left over in that budget?
It all depends on the year. Yes, there are times we do have money. Then there's times that we don't. We do have people that we don't get done based on the fact that they sent their money in, but our contractors are busy. And by the time we get everything bundled, it's too late in the season. And so we actually refund their money at the end of the year and then ask them the following year if they want to be back on the list.
Okay. Also, I think that especially in this time of COVID with other departments I've been talking to about different issues, tracking seems to be everything. And I'm not trying to bring COVID into this, but what I am trying to bring into this is, do you do any type of tracking, not only on how many residents participate in this program, but the sections of neighborhoods that they are in? And is any financials required to see if these folks even have enough money to pay for this? I mean, I don't mean financials like heavy duty. I just mean, you know, do you really have the money to pay for this? And is there any way that is tracked to get a feel for where the bad sidewalks are, why they continue to be bad? Is it because we're running into folks that can't afford to pay for it, which I think is a lot of folks in the district that I serve? So I'm kind of wondering about what we're doing in the way of tracking this information.
We do know where all the sidewalk complaints are. We do track that information within our city works. So we have a record of all the complaints that we do receive. We do not look at a financial ability to pay. Anybody that's in the city that's a resident is offered the 50-50 program. I'm sure there's some that would find it difficult to cover that 50%, but we don't ask.
Yeah, I don't know. The other thing I was starting to look at is to see if there's other cities where there is not a 50-50 program, to see if there's other cities that actually pay for either through, you know, a partial, some kind of grant process, and then, you know, the half-cent sales tax, I think, this money is going to be coming out of. But what we see is in Oakland is that some of the worst sidewalks are because of the age of the sidewalks, because of the huge trees that we definitely don't want to get rid of, but that are causing the bumping up of the cobblestone, you know, sidewalks. And the older folks especially, or the new families that have kids that want to walk through these neighborhoods, have no ability to walk down their entire block because it's just crap. And so I'm wondering if there's any kind of innovative programming that is out there, especially because this is an LMI, you know, district that can possibly be looked into, that can help, you know, help deter some of this cost to the citizens, whether the bad sidewalk is being complained about by them, whether it's being complained about by their neighbor or what have you. What are we doing in a proactive stance to look at some of this and address the cost issue?
And I could let Bill maybe talk to this. One of the things that we've talked about in the past is doing a quick look to see if someone is financially able to pay. And if they're not, the city picking up additional, instead of 50%, maybe 75%, or possibly even more than that. We haven't incorporated that yet, but we do not actively go out and look for problems. We do only respond to complaints. And usually it's not the property owner that complains because they know they have to pay to fix it. it's usually a neighbor.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I also think that if there was something more proactive that was more helpful to folks that are on limited income, because we have some folks in our area that live on $800 a month. So it's going to be next to impossible for them to fix up some horrific sidewalks right, in their front, past their front gate. And so I do believe if there was a more proactive approach to this, I think that you would be receiving calls, not so much, complaining on the neighbor, but yes, we want to work to get our sidewalks fixed. What programs are available? Because again, this is a quality of life issue. And I know that I'm not on this committee or anything, but I would really ask that y'all consider holding back on doing anything until we can research more of these methods before we start putting more responsibility on the resident. Because the other part of this, Brian, is that I was thinking about is by some chance, what if this is an elderly homeowner that cannot fill out this paperwork and might need some help? What kind of partnerships do we have with JAAA or something that can help them fill out this paperwork and go along with this process that it sounds like, if it does change, may put more responsibility on the homeowner's shoulder. And again, I'm thinking of the aging population that we have in so many of our districts.
Good comments. I guess question I'd have for the city manager is that, is there funding in other areas, block grant fundings that could help?
Well, right now with SORT, there's a large, often amount that is put towards the fixing of sidewalks in neighborhoods. So that is one area where we have done some work with CDBG money on fixing sidewalks and so forth. But a lot of that's actually GO bonding that's set aside for SORT. But it is one of those areas that oftentimes is utilized by folks that receive SORT money. We could, I think, also look, one of the projects that the governing body approved was the $200,000 of competitive grant that we need to develop that program and get something out there, but that is also a competitive grant program that it could be that sidewalks is something that they would look to apply for as part of the project if we've got that kind of an area designated. And then I think it goes to looking at the funding and the allocations that we do with our half-cent sales tax and some of those other types of things, and deciding if that's a priority push that we want to make to do more in that area. We could sure look at that.
Yeah, it's a unique situation where you're responsible for the maintenance of something on property you don't own, but I understand why it is. But
right. And it's a challenge
for folks.
I know that the city of Lawrence has been struggling for the last couple of years as they've gone out and done proactive identification of sidewalks and determining where the work is going to be done, and then start asking people to fix their sidewalks. It's been a issue that has been hotly contested over there as to whether they should be that proactive. And so looking at that, it is a concern. I know that from when I worked in Mason City, we would take about a 4 or 5 block area every year, and we would go out and mark the sidewalks that need to be replaced. And so there was a sidewalk program, but the cost was always on the owner. However, they would have the opportunity, if they wanted to, they could assess it to their property taxes. So we would pay for it, and then it would be assessed back, and then they could pay for it over time, which helped in some instances for people. We became the financing arm for that effort.
Right.
Brent?
Yes.
I mean, that certainly is a possibility. I mean, seeing if something could be put back on their property tax. I think that there are good ideas in there with SORT and, the $200,000 grants, but those are contingent, though, on the NIAs, I believe, or neighborhood associations filling this out. If we're wanting a more, individual approach to this, individual homeowner approach to this, when Brian was talking last week, in a lot of ways did make sense. I believe that it's a possibility that may work if we explored more proactive ways, and if we explored about having options in place if help would be needed, as more of the responsibility would come to these individual homeowners with, paperwork or whatever, because again, I'm thinking about the older population here. I really think that this beautification, this quality of life, as we continue to state that we want to build up and keep working on our older communities, sidewalks are imperative. Sure. So that families and elders and kids can go run outside on their sidewalks without fear of tripping and blooding themselves, which some of the sidewalks in Oakland are that horrific. So, those are just food for thought, Chair. And I would just say that, I would help in any way I could to continuing the dialogue and communication, because this really does impact my district.
Very good. Thank you, Councilwoman. Good comments, and we'll look forward to more information on the sidewalk program as a whole in future meetings. So that will be on our next agenda. I believe we talked about adding discussion of the lease program, where that stands next month as well. And I think since December, end of the year actually ends the charter for this committee. I think we need to look at whether there's an appetite for extending the infrastructure committee, either as a permanent committee or for a period of time, probably another year. Guess I would look for some discussion on that quickly. And then we can make a recommendation. We can put that on the agenda for action in December and make a recommendation to the full city council. Councilman Padilla, thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I do think it's a good idea. Holding these meetings has really brought out a lot of detail on some of the information that sometimes, at least for myself, I get as a big whole story, and I don't get the detail of the story. And I think I have benefited from listening to the presentations with a little more understanding of how we're planning and what we're looking at. So I think the committee itself is serving a good purpose. I would recommend that we continue with it. Of course, membership could change after the first year, but I do think that as a committee itself, I think it's a worthwhile effort. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Deputy Mayor Emerson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Councilman Padilla. I think when most people think of the city, they really think of police, fire, and closely behind as our infrastructure. So I think this is probably as important as any committee, and I would be in favor of it being a standing committee, at least for the next few years.
Very good. So I guess the direction to the city manager would be to bring a resolution or whatever the appropriate vehicle is up for discussion at the next meeting. Any other items for the agenda?
Chair, the only two items that we still feel that we would like to discuss with the committee at some point is, even though it wasn't a charge of the committee, the Utilities Department has a great deal of projects that they do. And I think that at some point we need to have a presentation as it relates to looking at those projects, and not seeking approval of the committee, because that was done by the governing body, but I think allowing this committee to hear a presentation from the Utilities Department and understand in more depth what projects are being done and so forth, ask questions, and as you said, really expose more detailed information about the efforts that we're making and the positive steps that we're making as far as replacing water lines and the plant and the various things that we're proud of that we're accomplishing. And I think that providing that detail is, I think, something this committee should receive and be able to ask questions on, and then be able to make a report. The other area is our facilities, our various buildings and that kind of work that we're doing. We have the FIRM program, and I think outlining the various efforts that we're making on improving our facilities and what types of projects we're doing, what the plan is, the procedures that we're following. It's pretty detailed in what we're trying to accomplish, and I think as we're looking at all of our locations, fire stations, City Hall, Holiday Building, the various things that we're looking at, I think that's our next step. We would look at probably that being more of a January. Right now with the lease program and some other things, Hannah's tied up. It's going to be till January before she's ready to think of presenting in that area. And you know, since it isn't a charge, we could, you know, we wouldn't have to do utilities, but if there was time, we could be prepared potentially to present on some of those utility projects as well.
Would that be Braxton presenting on that?
Yes, that's the intent. Braxton's been attending these meetings to support in case there are questions.
We might have to.
Braxton, do you have anything you want to add in that respect?
No, I'm happy to do any level or focus. I think that it may exhaust the 2 hours that the committee typically allots to talk about all of our projects. I could do a quick and dirty overview, or I could focus on a particular area. I know Councilmember Dobler was at a recent presentation that we did on our water line replacement program and how data-driven that has become. So that would be an example. Councilmember Dobler had also asked about an update on the status of the treatment plants. And so I'm happy to provide information to the committee on any and every aspect of utilities.
My thought is, based on what we have on the agenda, maybe we could allow 45 minutes or so for Braxton to present on like those topics, and that would probably fill our 2 hours and take advantage of our time if we wanted to pursue that.
Yeah, I think a presentation on the pipe replacement program would be first and foremost. We could have a little discussion on that, and then, yeah, just maybe an overview of the bigger projects at the plants.
Okay.
Whatever he feels is relevant would be outstanding.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other items from the staff? Anything from the committee? Seeing none, I believe we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil.
Yeah, thank you.